hope Jellyfish class enjoyed the rest of the story. The Twits. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it is impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be a bigger job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this. How often do these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it once a week, like us on a Sunday night? Do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to the barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed? Or do they do it themselves in front of a bathroom with nail scissors?
I don't know, but next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things.
Chapter 2. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts from his nose and his ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was born a twit, and now at the age of 60 he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash his bristly nail brush face? The answer is never, not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. Chapter 3. Dirty Beards. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough. And there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel and we quickly look more or less all right again, but a hairy man cannot do that. We can also, if we're careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces, but not the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth really wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce inside without leaving some of it on his hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth when he ate, and as a result, because he never washed, there was always hundreds of bits of old breakfast, lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or a sleeve whilst he was eating. But if you looked closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to his hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup, and fish fingers, and minced meat and chicken livers, and all the disgusting things that Mr. Twit liked to eat.
If you looked closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peered deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand. Things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine.
And because of this, Mr. Twit never really went hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Chapter 4. Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because at any rate that would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Just take a look at her.
Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. The funny thing is, Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She'd had quite a nice face when she was young, and the ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. But why would that happen? I'll tell you why.
If a person has ugly thoughts, they begin to show on your face. And when the person has ugly thoughts every day, every week and every year, that face will get uglier and uglier until it is so ugly you can hardly look at it. A person who has good thoughts can never be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, a crooked mouth and a double chin and sticky out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that it was because she had warts growing on the sole of her foot and that walking was painful. But the real reason she carried it was so that she could hit things with it like dogs and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. Chapter 5. The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again any time you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it in Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking his beer slowly. The froth had made a ring around his hairs on his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," said Mrs. Twit, keeping her back turned to him so he wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick that he could play on his wife later that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I will watch you like a wombat." "Oh, shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said, and he went on drinking his beer, his evil mind working away on the latest horrid trick that he could play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat,
he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful."
Chapter 6. The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog in between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit climbed back to bed and put out the light.
She lay there scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itchy. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. And then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet.
She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's a giant skillywiggler. I saw it on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like sharp screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me, it's on my feet." "I bet it'll bite your toes off," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a cold jug of water. He poured the water all over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her.
The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water, and it started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water, and this one was having a great time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night, and she screamed again. By golly, it is a giant skilly-wiggler, Mr. Twit said. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed, flew downstairs, and spent the night on the sofa. And the frog went to sleep on her pillow.